What if Hitler had won? What if history had taken a darker path? What if Nazi Germany had won World War II? What if Adolf Hitler had achieved total victory? This is not fiction. This is a dangerous possibility the world narrowly escaped. If Hitler had won, Europe would look very different. Germany would control France, Italy, Eastern Europe, and Soviet territories. Borders would disappear. Resistance would be crushed. Berlin would become the center of global power. Britain would not remain free. Democracy would end. Free speech would vanish. Millions more would be killed. Not only Jews, but anyone considered different. Education would become propaganda. Children would be trained to obey. Science would serve power, not humanity. The nuclear age would begin under tyranny. Culture would be censored. History would be rewritten. War would never truly end. Fear would replace hope. This future did not happen because people resisted. Because soldiers fought. Because sacrifices were made. History changed because Hitler lost. If Hitler had won, freedom would not exist today. Democracy would be a memory. The modern world would. What if, at several key moments, history had taken a different turn? In June 1940, a faction in the British government urged making peace with Germany. That same September, the Royal Air Force was within a whisker of defeat. By October 1941, Moscow was in panic as German troops stood just 40 miles away. Had any of these junctures gone differently, Adolf Hitler's dream of a total conquest of Europe might have become a terrifying reality. But what would that world have looked like? This is not a story of simple victory, but of a chilling, endless ambition. Historians like Gerhard L. Weinberg, by examining the hints left by wartime leaders, tell us that in Hitler's mind, victory in World War II was never the final goal. It would merely be the prelude to World War III, and then World War IV, until Germany had conquered the entire globe. First, Europe would be remade. Countries deemed Nordic, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, Finland, would be directly annexed. Eastern Europe and Western Russia, up to the Ural Mountains, would become a vast slave colony called the General Government, a resource to be brutally exploited. In the West, while Mussolini's Italy might get a piece of the old Roman Empire, Hitler intended to keep firm control over France and Britain. The Nazi ideology would be enforced universally. The systematic eradication of Jewish people and others deemed subhuman would continue across all conquered territories. But the terror went further. The regime also planned to eliminate organized Christianity and even introduce state-sanctioned polygamy to repopulate Germany after the millions of expected war deaths. Hitler saw his allies as temporary conveniences. Japan, called an honorary Aryan, was expected to do the dirty work of conquering Asia and the Pacific, only to be turned on and destroyed once the United States was dealt with. This highlights a fatal flaw in Hitler's worldview, a monumental ignorance driven by virulent racism. He consistently underestimated the United States, dismissing Americans as a race of mongrels incapable of serious threat. This blindness persisted even as American industry and manpower became the backbone of the Allied war effort. So, how could this nightmare have started? Many alternate histories point to a single, fateful week in 1940, the evacuation of Dunkirk. In our timeline, a controversial halt order by the German High Command, combined with bad weather for the Luftwaffe, allowed a miracle to happen. Nearly 340,000 trapped British and French soldiers were rescued by a flotilla of civilian boats. But change just one variable: clear skies over the English Channel. With perfect bombing weather, the evacuation fleet becomes an easy target. The pocket at Dunkirk collapses. Instead of a heroic rescue, Britain suffers a catastrophic defeat, with most of its professional army captured or killed. The political and morale shock in London would have been immense. Facing this disaster and with 250,000 British sons in German prison camps, the political will to fight on may have shattered. A peace settlement, however uneasy, becomes a real possibility. With Britain neutralized, Hitler could turn his undivided might eastward against the Soviet Union, without the draining Battle of Britain or the need to divert forces to the Mediterranean. The initial stages of Operation Barbarossa might have been even more devastating. Yet, Hitler's grand strategy contained the seeds of its own destruction. His plan for endless conquest would have inevitably forced the remaining free world, primarily the still powerful United States and a betrayed Japan, into an alliance against their common, monstrous foe. A Cold War, but far hotter, would ensue. And here, technology decides the final outcome. Even as Hitler dreamed of a one-way America bomber to crash into New York skyscrapers, the United States was developing a real response. The Convair B-36 Peacemaker, the world's first intercontinental bomber, was designed for this very scenario, to strike Berlin from bases in North America. By 1948, this bomber would be operational, and by then, the United States possessed an arsenal of over 50 atomic bombs. Meanwhile, Germany's own nuclear program was fragmented and far behind. The final act of this alternate history, therefore, would not be a Nazi victory parade, but the silent flight of bombers across the Atlantic. Hitler's thousand-year Reich, built on slavery and hatred, would likely have been extinguished in a single, fiery day, beneath dozens of mushroom clouds. The master race, defeated by the mongrels he so despised, in a war he believed he had already won. This was the world Hitler dreamed of. But military occupation and redrawn borders are only the beginning. To build their new world, the Nazis would wield their most dangerous weapons, the control of psychology and culture. Every citizen in Europe would carry a national identity card, classifying their race. The sole purpose of education would be to produce loyal soldiers and obedient mothers. All books, newspapers, and radio programs would follow directives issued from Berlin. An attempt would be made to erase the past. The names of countries like Poland and Czechoslovakia would vanish from history books, replaced merely by numbers of German administrative districts. Yet, resistance is born in response to every tyranny. In dense forests and remote mountain areas, illegal partisan groups would become active. Sometimes blowing up a railway line, sometimes assassinating a Nazi official. These resistors could be former soldiers, religious leaders, or ordinary housewives carrying secret messages. For them, every explosion, every clandestine broadcast was a message: you are not alone. We will never accept you. Looking at the world map, this new darkness would not be confined to Europe. Japan, under its Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, would have solidified its dominance over East Asia. Nations like China, Korea, and Southeast Asia would be subject to orders from Tokyo. Instead of America and Britain, the world would now have Japan and Germany as the two great powers, locked in a fragile, unstable alliance. Each would view the other with suspicion, knowing their partnership was one of mere convenience. What would happen to the rest of the world? German and Japanese eyes would be fixed on the oil reserves of the Middle East, sparking new conflicts in the region. Hitler had even dreamed of making South America a German colony, which could have plunged Latin America into civil war-like conditions between pro-German and anti-German factions. But history teaches us one inevitable lesson: any authoritarian system, no matter how powerful, eventually succumbs to its own poison. Hitler's system was built on hatred, suspicion, and fear. One day, even in Berlin itself, a power struggle would erupt among the top Nazi officials. Who is the true successor? Whose ideology is more pure? Himmler? Göring? This internal strife would weaken the entire regime from within. Meanwhile, a spark of hope would be smoldering among the oppressed peoples. Pamphlets secretly pasted on the streets of Warsaw. Hidden printing presses in the underground catacombs of Paris. Covert networks of refugees in the old churches of Moscow. These small acts of defiance would one day become a tidal wave. And then the time would come when the B-36 Peacemaker bombers from New York cross into airspace. They would carry not just bombs, but declarations of freedom, instructions for rebellion, and messages of hope. They would come not to destroy, but to plant the seeds of liberty. The greatest lesson of this alternate history is that the human spirit can never be permanently enslaved. After a handful of decades of power and fear, when the force of justice and freedom finally rises, it becomes a storm that washes away any wall, any army, and any dictator. Hitler's 1,000-year Reich might not have lasted even a century, because the tide of history always flows toward freedom. No matter how many twists and turns it takes. This was the story that did not become our world's story. The story of our world is in our own hands.